Hey guys, this is it. This is what a lot of people have been asking for, the DirectX 11 tutorial. Now, um, let me prefix this by saying what you'll need is you'll need to be using Visual Studio 2012. Now you can use that on Windows 7 or Windows 8. The reason being is you need the Windows 8 SDK. Now, don't pay the fact that it says Windows 8 SDK can still be used for Windows 7. The point is it comes with Visual Studio 2012. And it already includes in it DirectX. So there's no more SDK. Now this will mean a significant amount of stuff will change. If you've watched any other people's DirectX tutorials, they probably use the SDK. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that doesn't work or doesn't transition because there are some libraries that they've deprecated and gotten rid of. For good reason, because now with Windows 8 store apps, there's a lot of stuff that changes. So to start, this tutorial is going to cover the basic Win32 window setup. I've done tutorials like this before. This one's going to be really kind of in-depth, hopefully better than the other ones, and it's just going to start off the series on a good note. So to start, we're going to create a new project in Visual Studio 2012, and we're going to create an empty project. Now, I have this tutorials folder, and I'm just going to call it tutorial 1, actually 00. I'm just going to do, call it setup. Okay, so once you have your empty project, you should see nothing here except for these folders. Now, in source files, you're going to add a new item, and we're going to add a CPP file, which is a C++ implementation file. Call it WinMain, and this is where your entry point is going to be. Now I'll explain that in a bit, but first we're going to create our, because we want to do this tutorial as much object-oriented as we can. I've seen other tutorials do it like with just functions and then calling those. What we're going to do is we're going to create actual classes to wrap our implementation. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a class. We'll click here. We're going to call this DX app. So it's basically just going to wrap everything we need for Win32 Window and DirectX. We're also going to click this virtual destructor, which basically means that this class is basically an interface. It's an abstract class. So I hope you understand what those mean. Abstract. So first off, I'm going to explain the entry point to start. The main entry point for every Win32 application will look something like this. First, we're going to include Windows, the Windows header file. This contains everything we need for Windows Win32 development, desktop development. In here is a boatload of classes, among other things. So to start, every main returns a int. But with this, we have to prefix it with WinAPI, and then call it WinMain. And I'll just select this auto, and I'll explain these in a second. And we're just going to return 0. Okay, so this is what a entry point looks like for a Win32 application. It's a WinAPI function, which means basically it's a Win32 entry point. What gets passed in is these H-instance handles. Now, what these are is this is the instance of your application, so it's basically a handle to your application. This is deprecated. It's not really, see how it's an input that's optional. It's not used anymore. It's legacy. It's back when I think 16-bit Windows development. So that's years ago. That's like mid-90s. This is the command line args. So it's a string that contains your command line arguments. And this is an integer that is basically a show code where it'll determine how your window is going to show for the first time, but we're not really going to use that, so this is also kind of optional. You could use it, but so that's basically the entry point. Now if we run this, it should run fine. Build succeeded. There we go. It doesn't do anything because we haven't really done anything. I could show you something happening. Let's display a little message box. Actually we can't. Actually, yeah. No. Hello world. Actually, this should be test. Hello world. And null. So we're going to run this. What should happen is it should display a little message box. Oh, I flipped them around. My bad. Well, so there's your little message box. So as you can see, that's the entry point. It's running, works fine. And we can get rid of that. So now back over here. So how are we going to make a Win32 window? Now Win32 windows they require a little bit of setup, but it's basically the same code anytime you want to make a Win32 window. So having this class will help us. Now, first, we're going to have a constructor that looks a little bit different. We can actually get rid of this one, and we're just going to replace that void with an H instance. So we're going to get that handle, which, by the way, first we need to, of course, include windows.h. Make sure that you're using this. You see up here, it says that it's referencing the Windows Kit's 8.0 version, because again, we're going to really need to use the Windows Kit for Windows 8 for this tutorial series. Another thing is we can get rid of this now, and we're going to have to change this to also take in that H instance because we changed the constructor definition. So, and here we're just going to include our DX app. So what should happen now is this should run fine. There we go. Now one thing that we're probably going to want to do is right up here we're going to define something called Win32 lean and mean. And what this does, it sounds pretty cool, right? Lean and mean. This strips this header file, making it only include what's absolutely necessary for Win32 desktop development. Like, we don't need, some cryptography stuff. We don't need networking, really. All we need is basics. So that's what this does. Okay, so right now we're gonna define some public methods. So this is what's going to be the main application loop. So for any application basically that runs, you need to have basically a loop that it stays into, and Windows does this with a message loop, and I'll explain that in a bit. So it just returns an int, call it run. We're gonna have some framework methods. These are going to be virtual because they're overwritten by the inheriting class. This one's going to be just an initialization method. And then we're going to have our update. And these are going to be pure virtual, which means they must be overridden. They can't not be overridden, because if they're not, then you can't really do anything. It'll throw an error. So both of them. Now I'm passing delta time into render also, because maybe you want to do some sort of animation things in the render function as well. So might as well. And then one more thing, which I'll explain in a bit. This is a very important method. It's the Windows procedure function, message procedure. Param. And I'll explain these. So there we go. Those are our basic framework methods that we need. And now we're going to create some, actually this should be protected, because we want access in inheriting classes. Okay, so for this, do I have? No. For this, what we need is some basic variables. Now what we're going to do is these are going to be Win32 attributes, because underneath this eventually we're going to have DirectX attributes. So first we're going to need an H window object. Now this is basically a handle to your application window. Next is we want an H instance. As you can remember before, this is the handle to the actual instance of your application. We're going to want some unsigned integers. Uint is basically the VC++ shortcut. It's a type define, as you can see if I hover over. Oh, it doesn't want to show me. Just stands for unsigned integer. This will be client width. This will be client height. So these are height. So these are going to be what we want our window to pop up as, the width and height of it. The client, not the window, the draw space. Next, we're going to want to include basically string, so that we can do std string, and just going to name this app title. So this will be the string that's displayed at the title bar. And finally, we want a D word, which is basically D word is an unsigned long. It's a type defined for unsigned long. You know, it's just weird. Don't worry. Yeah, you could just type unsigned long. This is the window style, and I'll explain that too. So this is all we need as far as attributes. These are easy. These three are pretty easy. Now these need some explaining, and that's where we'll explain it right here. Now, first we'll set them. So this should be set to H instance. This should be set to null because we don't have a window yet. The client width can be set to, I don't know, 800. Sounds about right. Client height should be set to, I don't know, 600. And the app title we can just set to DirectX 11 application. Or I'm just going to actually set it to the tutorial name. So tutorial 00 setup, Win32 setup. And oh yeah, we need the window style. And what we're going to set this to is they're prefixed WS. There's overlapped window. Now, if you hover over this, you can see how it all has all these bits handed together. There's overlapped caption, system menu, thick frame, minimize box, maximize box. These are window styles. Now this one is the basic one where you can resize it, you know, maximize it, minimize it, all that. That's a basic, just straight out of the box application window. So that's what we're going to set that to. And now what we're going to do is we're going to implement our first the run method, which is our main application loop. Okay, so for this, you have to kind of understand what Windows does. Now, Windows, every application on Windows runs in a loop where messages from the application to the OS are sent back and forth. So, like if I were to go and hit this close, that sends a message to the application, well, actually to Windows, to then close it. So it will then pump that back, and the application will close, and destroy itself. So it will just quit. It's basically kind of like typing exit, but it's actually called post quit message, and then does the same thing. So that's how that works. But we have to actually write that loop. We have to write a loop that handles those messages. So every kind of basically a message is typed as MSG. And not what you think, not the food. MSG equals 0. So we're just going to initialize this message. And this is the way you initialize everything to 0. It's basically like you set it to the empty set, so basic structs can be auto-initialized all to 0 by doing this. So you can loop while WM, that WM stands for Windows message. So while the Windows message typed quit doesn't equal our message, stored message, so that message structure has a unsigned integer message, and this is basically the value. So if these are, whenever these are equal, we want to break out and end our application. So in here, what we're going to want to do is call something called peak message. So we're going to look at these messages that are being pumped through, and we're going to store it into our message. But we're also going to pass in null for all these other things because we don't really care about them. Except for this last one. This is the peak message, basically describing what it's going to do. So it'll peek at the message and it'll remove it from the stack. We don't want to keep the message there. We want to take them all off, each one that we look at. So that'll just remove it. So then we're going to translate message and pass in the message. We're going to dispatch it. This is just for like keyboard input and responding to things. You got to do these. And then every time we're free to do what we want, we're going to update. And we'll just pass in 0 for now. I'll show you how to calculate delta time in a second. And we're going to render. And pass in 0.0. So in the off time, we're basically just going to update and render. And then at the end, if we ever break out of this, we need to return. So we're going to return static cast to an int, the message.w param. So that's basically where our exit code is going to be stored. And there you go. That's the main message loop. So main message loop. Right? So there you go. So next thing that we have to tackle is we have to tackle these two. These are going to be overridden. We don't need to actually define these. But this one and this one we're going to have to define defaults for. So to start with the init, we're actually missing one more function that we probably want to make. Is we have to actually make our window, right? So this is where we're going to initialize the Win32 window. So we're going to have a bool init window function. It's just going to return a boolean. So our init function, which by the way I have something called Visual Assist X. Some people have been asking me. It's basically a plugin. You can search for it on Google. It allows you to do some cool refactoring stuff like this, create implementation, and it'll auto create it. So it saves you a bit of time. But yeah. So in the initial init method, all we're going to do is say if not init window, return false, otherwise return true. So that's a pretty simple init method. And then for the init window, might as well. Well, first what we're going to do is I'm going to explain this. So we're going to make this method first. So I'm going to create implementation. So you can see, here it is. And for this, what we do is we're going to do a switch on the message. That was also Visual Assist, and I don't like it when it does that, but it's okay. The default, what we're going to do is, actually I'm going to get rid of that. Okay. So first thing we're going to check for, remember how I explained how the message loop works? Here's where we actually implement what we do when we get specific messages. So see how our loop runs until we get a quit message? Well, first we're going to find to see if we ever have a WM destroy message. So that's sent, let's say when you hit close. WM close sends a WM destroy message, which then you have to handle. So what we're just going to do is we're going to, guess what? we're going to post a quit message with the code 0, and then we're going to return 0. So what this does is basically we're going to post the quit message to the pipeline, and then this is going to retrieve that and then be like, oh, look at that, WM quit equals our message. Let's break out. So that's how you're going to end your application. So there you go. Then what we're also going to do is default. We're going to return the default window proc, and we're just going to pass through our message wparam lparam. So this is basically just a handle to the window that you're don't use the that window handle. You have to use the one that's tied to this message procedure, which is passed through here. And these store things like mouse position, key down, certain specific codes like that are stored in these lparam and wparam. But you don't really have to worry about that for this tutorial. So now we have this message procedure. I have to explain that this is supposed to be defined as a callback function, but you can't define member functions as callback. So what we're going to have to do is, it just doesn't work. So we have to find a way to pump our messages from like a global callback function to our defined user defined one. So the way to do this is we're just going to create like this empty namespace and create a global pointer to an app and set it to a null pointer. So use to forward messages to user defined proc function. So we're going to use this to pump our messages through. Now to do that, we're going to create another version of that message procedure, except this one's going to actually be defined as a callback. We're going to call this main window proc. And it's just going to have the same parameters. Now you may think, this is weird and it's kind of unnecessary, but it is actually necessary because this keyword is actually what makes this work once we set it into our window. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to check to see if our pointer exists, and then we're just going to return that pointer, the pointer's version of the message procedure, which is going to be this one that we defined right here. Otherwise, if it doesn't exist, we're also going to return the default window procedure because we needed to return something. Okay, so there you go. So now we have basically everything we need to create our initialize window method and then run. So what we're going to do is finally we're just going to create the implementation for this. I'm going to copy this and move it, cut it actually, and move it underneath the init method. I always like to have this at the very last because it's kind of its own little thing. Okay, so here, the first thing you need when you create a Win32 desktop app is you need a window class which describes some properties of your window, like the icons, the cursor, the brush background, the style, but not the window style, but the basically like the what happens whether it redraws horizontally or vertically or both. So, which it doesn't really matter for us because we're using DirectX, which overrides a bunch of stuff. So what we're going to do is create window class ex wcx. We're going to zero memory this, which is essentially just setting everything in it to 0. And size of window class x. And then we're going to set some properties of it. So see all these? Now a couple of these you don't really have to worry about, but we're still going to set them like this. These are extra bytes. We don't really need extra bytes for anything, extra memory bytes. The CB size is just going to be set to the size of window class x. And now here's where we can set also the style. We're just going to set it to do class style horizontal and vertical redraw, But since we're not using the GDI paint functions, we're using DirectX, which is going to override the pixels anyway for our client. We don't need to worry about ever really doing that. GDI is like super old and from like the 90s. So, well, I guess GDI Plus is a little bit more recent, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so here's where we actually start with the important stuff. So here's where you set the instance for your window. So we're going to set that equal to our handle to our application instance. Then we're going to set the window procedure. Now, this is not going to be this one. It's going to be our main window proc, the one we defined up above. And make sure that you don't have the these, because it actually takes it as a callback. So it's kind of like, think of it like a delegate with C#, where you don't actually pass it. You just set it equal with just the name. That's kind of how callback functions work. Next, we can set the icon. Now, to set an icon, there's a load icon function, and we're just going to set it to something that's built in. We're going to set it to application. So you pass in for H window, you just define null, and then it's ID for icon application. Now, the other way to do this would be you can import resource file, and then you can do call make int resource with the ID, and then you pass in like your own window handle, and then that's how you can define custom icons. So like that's a custom icon for Visual Studio right there. So for cursor, it's a similar thing. Load cursor null, and then you do null, and then IDC for ID cursor, and then we're just going to use the standard arrow. Here we're just going to do HBrush background. This is what your client background's cleared to the first time you run it, or when you repaint to it. This is just going to be HBrush. We're going to call get stock object, and null brush, which will just return a null brush, so it doesn't actually clear it to anything. Next thing is we're going to have we're going to do the menu name. We're not actually having a Windows menu. Windows menus are like this: the file, edit, view, project. Since ours is like a game app window, we don't need that. So that's just going to be null. For the next thing we're going to have is the class name. Now this is important. This should you have to remember. This defines, this is what you can, the name of this class, so it will find it that way when you create your window. So this one is going to be DXApp window class. Something that's just standard and we can remember. And finally, the icon small. So this is the smaller icon that I think is up here in the corner. This will just be the same thing. So load icon null IDI application. There you go. So that's our window class defined. Now this is used to create our window, which we'll do in a second. Now before you can do that, we need to actually register this with the Windows OS, so that it knows when it tries to create your window, like what you're talking about. So if not register class ex, and then you pass in wcex. So if this fails, we clearly can't continue. So we're just going to return false. But what we should also do is have some way to know that we just failed. So we're just going to output debug string failed to create window class, and I'm just going to pass some like new lines like crazy. Whoa. Or just like one new line, I guess. Maybe one before, so that I can see it in the output. And there we go. Okay, so if this succeeds, what we should do now is try and create our window. So here we go. We're going to try and create our window. So actually, before we do that, What we want is, you know how we set our client width? We want our clients, our drawer area, to definitely be 800 by 600. Now, in order to do that, we need to make it so the window is created with the correct width and height, because if we try just passing in client width and client height, it'll include the title bar as well in that calculation. So what we need to do is create a rectangle object, initialize it with the full size of our window that we want, our client. We want to do adjust window rect, I think it is. Yeah, window rect. We want to pass in our window style. Remember, that's important, the window style we made, and then pass in false because we don't have a menu. And now we want to get the correct width. So I guess these can be unsigned integers too. Uint width equals r dot right minus r dot left, and then height equals r dot bottom minus r dot top. So this will get us the correct width and height. So now we can actually create our window. So here we go. We do set app window, and handle the app window equals create window. We need to pass in this class name, so I'm just going to copy it so it knows what class we used. For the window name, we have our app title dot cstring, because it takes a cstring. Our window style, which here we have our window style. The X and Y we can do a little trick on. It'll probably be easier to do it out here. So uint X will be get system metrics smcx screen divided by 2 minus width divided by 2. Now what this does is this gets your whole screen size, right? Your X, the horizontal of your entire screen desktop. And then if we divide that by 2 and then subtract by our width, our window width divided by 2, we can center the window perfectly. So every time you run your application, the window is just going to be centered. So we can do the same thing with the Y. So get system metrics smcy screen divided by 2 minus height divided by 2. Now we can just pass in X, Y, width, height. X, Y, width, height. Null for the parent, null for the menu, our application instance for the instance, and then null for the last one. So there you go. So now we also want to check to see if that exists, the window that we just tried creating. So if not, I forgot the not. So if not app window, we're just going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to copy and paste our error thing, but instead I'm just going to get rid of the class. And it's just going to say failed to create window. And finally, what we're going to do is we're going to go and show the window. So we're going to call show window. We're going to pass in our app window, and then we're going to pass in SW show as the code. Now, as you notice, that was the NCMD show before from the WinMain. You could, of course, if you want, pass that in, like store that right here in the constructor, pass in another int, and then capture that and use that, but I just don't think it's even necessary if we can just use the standard show. And then we're just going to return true if everything succeeds. So there we go. So this is all the code needed to set up your window. Now what we can do is we can test this out. First, let's compile to see if we have everything correctly built. Okay, it succeeded. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a test app, and it's going to extend our DX app class. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create a constructor, create a destructor, and now we're going to override those methods. So init override. This is a keyword for the Visual C++ compiler. If you declare this at the end, it'll throw an error if it's not actually an overrideable method. So we're also going to do update. override, render, override. That's all we need. So I'm just going to create the implementations for these quickly. If you don't have Visual Syntax, you're going to have to type these out. Sorry about that. This is just much easier and faster for you guys. Okay, so here what we also need to do is do dx_app and pass in each instance. So basically, it's calling the base constructor. It's similar to base in C#. That's the C++ way. Here we're just going to do if not dx_app init, return false, return true. Technically, we could just do return dx_app init. That does the same thing, actually. It's quicker. For update and render, we're not going to do anything right now. And that's it. So now we're just going to create it. So we're going to create test app, tapp, and pass in h instance. We're going to go if not tapp, tapp.init, return 1, and then we're just going to call return tapp.run. So what this should do is it should display a window. There you go. There's your window with our title and everything. Now we can go like that. See how it doesn't refresh the back buffer though? When we hook up DirectX 11 to it, we'll start clearing it and everything. But as you can see, oh, apparently we didn't do something right because that's still running. So that's probably because this is not right. So I don't know. Return false, return true, or we didn't return correctly. So that should be return. Okay, post quote message, bureau, show window, return false, return true, return false, return. No, it should have worked. Let's try it again. Because this should stop it. Nope, it's not stopping it. Oh, I know why. Derp. Okay, this global, see this global? That's actually a good way to test this. As you could see, because when we closed it, it wasn't doing what we said it to. We told it to post quote message. That's because this pointer doesn't exist. We were supposed to initialize it in here. Whoops. To this. So that it actually does use ours. So now if we run this, it works. It closes out and stops. So there you go. That's the basic Win32 setup. There's a little hiccup there, but it's all good. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial. The next one we will cover the calculating. Actually, I'll hold off on calculating delta time because it's not necessary yet until we actually have something to render. What I'll show you is how to initialize DirectX 11, the swap chain, the immediate context, and the device, and clearing the buffer to a color using the new DirectX namespace, which is part of the DirectX SDK. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned.